we're at an important crossroads now because we know more about how the mind and brain develop than we ever knew before. We're going to learn more in the next 10 and 20 years still. But it gives us an opportunity to redefine the standards of care for infants and children with severe developmental problems, including children with autistic spectrum disorders, but also other problems relating to communicating, including severe language problems, severe regulatory problems, children with Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, cerebral palsy, and even severe forms of attention deficit disorder. So we're now in a position to really redefine how we work with these children. The older model did the best that it could under the circumstances, and the older model worked with surface behaviors, a lot of behavioral work just to modify how children behave, because that was better than ignoring children and better than doing nothing, or better than simply trying to contain their aggressive or withdrawing behavior. And in its time, for a long time, was the only approach available. And the fact that that pioneered intensity for kids was a very, very promising development, because it got people working intensively and got people feeling optimistic about what could be done. But now we can go beyond working on modifying behaviors and work on some of the underlying issues that are giving the children trouble. The other very older approach has been to work on circumscribed cognitive skills, to sort of take lessons from older children. If an older child is supposed to learn how to identify shapes, we'll take a 3-year-old who has no language and work on matching shapes. And we'll do that in a kind of rote and repetitive way. Again, that's better than nothing. At least we're interacting with the child. At least we're doing some sort of encouragement of the child's cognition. But it's a piecemeal, isolated approach, working with this isolated cognitive skill, working with that isolated cognitive skill. And now with our understanding of how the mind and brain grow, we can do much better. So we can go beyond these two older approaches of working with surface behaviors, modifying behaviors, or working with isolated cognitive skills. And we can really now begin to systematize what might be called a developmental approach that synthesizes and integrates all the best information we have about how the mind and brain grow. There are 3 insights, I think, of the last 20 years that are the cornerstones of our new way of working with infants and children with developmental problems. One of these is the importance of affect, emotions, and relationships for the growth of the brain and the mind. It used to be thought that you want a particular cognitive skill, you stimulate that cognitive skill. Now we know that the brain grows most rapidly in the early years as an outgrowth of interactions with caregivers. And these interactions have to have a number of features. They have to have the feature of warmth and security, also regulation, where the child is not overwhelmed. There has to be a lot of relatedness and engagement. There has to be a lot of back and forth emotional signaling and gesturing. There has to be problem solving. And then there has to be using ideas in a meaningful and functional way. Give me my juice, I want this. And then there has to be thinking. No, I won't go to sleep now. Well, why? Well, because I want to stay up. So we have to have lots and lots of interactions with children that have to do with exchanging emotions and have to do with a fundamental sense of relatedness. When we deprive children of this relatedness, we see children in orphanages and other settings, they don't grow. Language doesn't develop. Cognition doesn't develop. And we've seen in our observations and our studies that even the simplest task of learning how to say hello is dependent on our emotions and our relationships. A child doesn't learn to say hello based on rules. You only say hello to first-degree relatives, or only say hello to people who live in a quarter-mile radius of your house. You say hello because you feel a friendly, emotional signal in your gut that signals trust or warmth, familiarity, and you wave and you say hello. If you feel something other than that, if you feel fear or anger, a child will hide behind mommy's leg and not say hello. It's not surprising that kids who are physiologically overwhelmed avoid and don't do the greetings, don't do the smile. So even something as simple as learning to say hello is signaled by our affects. But even something as complicated as math, to a 2.5 or 3-year-old, quantity concepts are learned not, again, by rote memory, by memorizing numbers, but by an emotional feel. A lot to a 3-year-old is more than you expect. A little is less than you want. And that's also emotional. And just the basic concept that Piaget talked about of causality in an 8 or 9-month-old, the ability to learn to be logical, to make things happen. Piaget thought the child learned to pull a string to ring a bell, and this was basically a cognitive motor act. But we know that the baby is pulling on mommy or daddy's heartstring with their smiles and with their vocalizations, with their joyful vocalizations at 2, 3, and 4 months. And if they get a response back, they begin having circles of communication, causal interactions, means, ends, relationships at 4 or 5 months earlier than Piaget thought in the emotional sphere. And this is because the child can control and regulate emotions and facial expressions that convey emotions much earlier than they can motor behavior. So emotions lead the way all the way through. They become especially important when we get to abstract thinking, like teaching a child the concept of justice or concept of fairness. We found that a child has to have 2 levels to do that. One is a level of lived emotional experience. They have to experience the phenomena of being treated fairly and unfairly. Giving a child 6 apples and taking it away and giving it to his sibling teaches them quickly what unfairness is. And then they can label that and abstract off of that and create a category of things that are fair, things that are unfair. But they have to have the lived emotional experience in order to know what the concept is all about. So every word in our language has to be lived first to understand it. You don't define an apple by its redness and roundness, you define it by how it tastes and what it feels like to throw it. So language, cognition, math, quantity concepts are all conveyed through interactive relationships through affects. That's one important new insight. So we can't teach children in the old-fashioned ways anymore, particularly children with special needs who have processing problems. And this means working not only with the relation with the child, but the whole family pattern, because it's within the family context and actually the cultural and community context that these relationships and these emotional interactions occur. So it means a much broader relationship-based, family-based approach, cultural and community approach to children with special needs. The second new insight is that in the last 10 to 20 years, we've also figured out what the important underlying processing capacities are that are behind children's worrisome behavior. So we've understood how children are different, individually different, in the way they process sounds, auditory processing, and language, the way they process what they see, visual spatial process, whether the child can find a hidden object, whether the child can search for an object, whether a child understands that mommy's in the next room and I'm here and doesn't get panicked, whether a child understands even more when he's in school that mommy is not too far away and is only a few minutes away, a time concept as well as a spatial concept. It'll only take me 30 steps, out this door and out that door to get to where mommy usually is. So auditory processing, language, visual spatial processing, also motor planning and sequencing. We find enormous variations in children in how they can plan actions. Some children can only do banging or can only put a car in a garage and take it out. Other children can take the car, put it in the garage, take it to grandmother's house, make a tea party at grandmother's house, and then bring the car back with some extra tea for mommy who's sitting back at the original house. So one child does a 1-step, 2-step, another child is doing a 6, 7-step planned action pattern. This we call motor planning and sequencing, which is enormously important for children. And we find a lot of the children with autistic spectrum disorders have severe problems with their motor planning and sequencing that underlies a lot of their repetitive behavior. Because if you can't plan and sequence, you're going to repeat. Right. So this is very, very important in understanding a lot of the symptoms. Also, we have observed that a lot of the kids have differences in the way they modulate sensation. Some kids are very overreactive to things like sound and touch, and they hold their ears, or they avoid and push away from people who try to tickle them. Other children crave sensory input, and they want more touch, and they want more noise. And some children have both the craving, they want more, but they get overloaded because they also have areas of sensitivity. And those children are very hard to find the right sensory pattern to pull them in and engage them. We find that a lot of children who are self-absorbed are underreacted to things like touch and sound. A lot of children who are very avoidant and keep running away from people, it's not because they don't love people, but it's because they're overreactive to things like touch and sound. So we need to look at the sensory modulation of the child to find the right pattern to pull that child into a relationship. So this is the second area of big insight, individual differences in the way the child processes their sensations and plans their motor actions. And this explains a lot of the surface behaviors. But if you work with the underlying processing differences, then you can influence many behaviors and help the child be adaptive across a broad range of issues rather than just work on isolated cognitive skills or isolated behaviors. And the third big area of insight based on our new research, is to understand what the early stages of development are. Historically, we've thought of development in very isolated ways. Motor development. We have a timetable for sitting up, for walking. Language development, when the first sounds are made, when the first words are made. For different areas of cognitive development, when a child searches in your hand for an object, when a child can stack blocks in a certain way, and so forth and so on. But each area has been separate. In social and emotional development, when a child will greet, when a child will play with peers, when a child will do some pretending. So we've had separate lines for each area of development, and those, as though these are somewhat independent of one another. But in fact, for the child, all these lines of development are interrelated. The child doesn't separate out their language, their motor skills. He doesn't say, well, I'm a 4-year-old motor-wise, but I'm only a 2-year-old language-wise, and only an 8-month-old social and emotionally. The child integrates all these in one smooth way. It's kind of like a basketball team. You've got to look at how the team plays together as an integrated unit. That determines whether the team wins or loses more than any individual player. Similarly, we haven't had a developmental roadmap for the team, for the mental team, language, cognition, affect, and emotions. In the last 10, 20 years, we've put together that what we call functional developmental roadmap, where we understand now the core levels that synthesize and integrate all the different developmental capacities. And we've identified 6 core levels and then additional ones beyond that that help us organize where we want to work with the child. And then we try to identify where the child is, not only in their language or motor development, which we do anyhow, but in their core functional developmental capacities. And then we meet the child where they are and work up the developmental ladder. And the 6 levels, just very briefly, are the ability for regulation and shared attention, which you need as a foundation, for engagement with warmth and trust and intimacy, for two-way purposeful communication, opening and closing circles of communication in a back-and-forth way with a lot of affective gesturing and micro-affective gesturing, smiles, smirks, head nods, the ability to take these gestures and organize them into problem-solving patterns. So we can actually take mommy by the hand, walk her to the refrigerator, bang on the door, and point to the juice. That may be 10 or 20 interactive gestures all targeted towards solving a problem. So that's our 4th stage, interactive problem-solving use of gestures. And then the 5th stage is the functional use of ideas. In language, me hungry, juice please, or in pretend play, feeding the dollies, hugging the dollies. And the 6th level is the ability to build bridges between ideas. So you can use language logically and realistically and shift gears between reality and fantasy. So the child, when he says, I want to go out, and you say, why? Because I want to play. Or the dolly is having a tea party. Well, how come the dolly wants to have a tea party? Because the dolly is hungry, or because the dolly is having a birthday, and they like to have tea parties on their birthday.